Have you ever buried the love of your life, only to discover on that very same day that your daughter no longer considers you part of the family? I lived through that. And what happened next, no one there was prepared to face it. Imagine being in mourning, your heart shattered, and hearing from your own daughter that you no longer have a place by their side. It was in that moment that I remembered the envelope my husband had secretly given me, and I realized perhaps he already knew that this day would come. Today I'm going to show you how a silent decision became the final period on the humiliation I had endured in silence for years. Every second counts because there are pains that, if you don't understand them in time, become invisible prisons. Stay with me until the end and find out what I did when I realized that, even as a widow, I still had the power to turn the tables. You won't believe what happened when I handed that paper to the lawyer. My name is Ana Maria Rios. I'm 67 years old, and until a few days ago, I was just a widow trying not to collapse in the face of my life partner's death. Joaquin died suddenly, the victim of a heart attack while he slept. We had been married for 42 years, with its pains, its routines, and some silences I never discussed with anyone. In an instant, I found myself alone in a house too big, with more memories than people to hear my sorrow. And perhaps the worst part of all was realizing on that very same day who really still saw me as part of the family. It was a stifling Thursday morning in Puebla. I had already spent the night sleepless, arranging the funeral papers, reviewing flowers, confirming with the funeral home. Something inside me refused to collapse, as if it was still necessary to keep order, even though the world had lost its ground. At 10:30 a.m., the main room of the wake began to fill. People I hadn't seen in years. Joaquin's co-workers, some older neighbors, even a cousin from San Luis Potosi showed up. But what truly hurt me was my eldest daughter Letitia's gaze, who, from the beginning, seemed to be there only out of protocol. Letitia had always been a hard figure, too practical even for a hug. She arrived in impeccable black, her children running between the benches, and her husband with the same cynical air as always. Not a kiss, not even a "how are you, Mum?" Just a dry nod. Mariana, on the other hand, arrived breathless, with tears in her eyes, bringing me a chicken pie that Joaquin always loved. "Did you eat anything?" was her first question. I shook my head. Letitia only watched from a distance, as if the whole thing were scenes from a soap opera she no longer wanted to participate in. During the ceremony, I noticed Letitia whispering to her husband. From time to time they looked in my direction and lowered their voices. That froze me. I've always had a sixth sense for these things. It seemed like something was being arranged, and I was the last to know. Later, while Joaquin's friends were saying their goodbyes and the coffin was closed, I went to the bathroom to compose myself. It was there that I overheard, for the first time, someone quietly comment something that made me tremble. "She doesn't know, right?" A woman with her back to me replied, "No, and it looks like she never will." I left there with a cold face and trembling hands. I was certain they were talking about me. At the burial, everything seemed like a blur. The earth being thrown, the half-choked prayers, the sound of shovels cutting the silence. It was at that moment that Letitia approached. I expected a gesture of consolation. I'm sorry. Perhaps even an apology for so much distancing. But what I received was a phrase whispered with the kind of cruelty that only those who carry old grudges can unleash. "You're not part of the family anymore. You were only Dad's wife." My throat closed. I didn't cry. I didn't say a word. I just stared into her eyes for a few seconds. It was a blow, but I didn't yet know how deep the wound was. After that, everything moved in slow motion. I returned home with Mariana, who noticed my silence but respected it. She made me tea, helped me take off my shoes, sat with me until I fell asleep on the sofa. In the middle of the night, I woke up alone in the living room, the hallway light still on. And then I remembered. The safe. The envelope. Joaquin's last words, when he placed that letter in my hands 2 years ago. "If one day I'm no longer here, give this to the lawyer." It will be the only way to protect what's yours. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. But now, everything made sense. I got up, walked barefoot down the hallway, and opened our bedroom closet. Behind some photo boxes, the safe. The combination had been the same since 1994. I turned the numbers carefully, as if opening a time capsule. Inside was the beige envelope, already slightly yellowed. It had the name of a lawyer Joaquin had trusted for years and a handwritten note. This deed is only for you, Aina, because you were the only one who never abandoned me. I sat on the edge of the bed with it in my hands. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel vengeance. I felt a strange kind of peace, as if, even from beyond, Joaquin was still taking care of me. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with the lawyer. Mariana offered to accompany me, and I accepted. Letitia didn't even call. She was too busy organizing the official reading of the will. According to her, Mariana looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Mom, what's in that envelope?" she asked. I only smiled and said, "The truth, but it will appear at the right time." And I knew that time was coming. 2 days later, we gathered in Letitia's living room for the will reading. It was a new, spacious house with modern furniture that never looked used. The coffee table was covered with papers organized by Letitia herself, marked with colorful sticky notes. Letitia was impeccable, as if this were a business meeting. Mariana arrived shortly after, with a box of cookies I had baked myself, in an attempt to soften the atmosphere. I carried the envelope in my purse. I said nothing, simply sat silently at the edge of the sofa. The lawyer hired by Letitia, young man with gelled hair and a black leather portfolio, began reading with formality. Will left by Joaquin Rios, in full possession of his mental faculties. Letitia crossed her legs and checked her watch as if she already knew the outcome. The document spoke of common assets, the car, the joint account savings, some family jewelry, but it never mentioned the vacation home in Tepoztlán, nor the small plot of land Joaquin had inherited from Uncle Esteban. I waited. When he announced the end of the reading, I leaned forward slightly and took the envelope from my purse. The sound of paper sliding across the table broke the silence. I handed it directly to the lawyer without looking at Letitia. My husband asked me to only hand this over when he was gone. I think the time has come. The lawyer, visibly surprised, opened the envelope, read the documents, looked at me, then at the daughters. Mariana seemed confused. Letitia furrowed her brow. Gradually, the lawyer's expression changed. "Mrs. Ana Maria Rios, this deed shows that your late husband transferred, while still alive, the Tepoztlán property exclusively to your name. It's a legal document, registered and authenticated." Letitia's eyes widened. For a moment, I thought she would protest, but she only leaned forward and said, "This must be fake. My father would never do this without telling us." The lawyer simply replied, "Not only did he do it, he made it clear it was his personal wish. Everything is properly recorded." Mariana looked at me, tears welling in her eyes. "Mom, did you know about this?" I shook my head. I knew he trusted me. "And now you know too." The room fell silent. For the first time, I wasn't the one who had to swallow hard. I hadn't expected such a reaction, but Letitia stood up, grabbed her cell phone, and stormed out of the room. Mariana stayed and hugged me without a word. The lawyer closed the meeting and collected the documents. The house felt different now. It was no longer hostile territory. It was just a cold building with walls painted in vanity. As I left, I noticed Letitia sitting in her car, staring at the steering wheel. I didn't go to her. It was no longer my role to fix the void she had created herself. On the ride home, Mariana drove in silence. Every now and then she stole glances at me, as if trying to understand what had just happened. "You know, Mom, I never really understood why Letitia always treated you that way. But today I realized that some people confuse presence with possession. You never demanded anything, and perhaps that's why she thought she could have everything." That hit me deeply. Joaquin used to say something similar when we were alone. That my greatest mistake was being too good to those who didn't know how to receive. Arriving home, I sat on the sofa with a sigh lighter than any I'd had in days. For the first time since the wake, I felt my body truly rest. It wasn't the weight of inheritance I was carrying, it was the weight of decades being ignored, silenced, diminished. And in that simple act of handing over an envelope, I had shouted louder than any argument ever could. Mariana brought me tea and sat by my side for the first time, unhurried. That night, I dreamed of Joaquin. He was sitting on the veranda of the Tepoztlan house, wearing that old hat he only used on weekends. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the horizon and smiled, as if silently approving. I woke with wet eyes, but not from sadness. It was as if I'd received confirmation that I had done the right thing. No matter how much Letitia thought that deed was an affront, it was actually my husband's final act of care for me. In the following days, Letitia didn't call. She sent no messages. Mariana, on the other hand, came every day. She brought fruit, market flowers, and sometimes just sat with me, watching silly TV shows. The absence of my other daughter still hurt, but it no longer burned like before. I gradually realized that Letitia's old wound came from somewhere I might never fully understand, perhaps from an invisible comparison with her father, or from things she carried in silence and never told me. On Friday, 4 days after the will reading, I received an email. It was from Letitia, a short, cold, direct text. I hope you're happy with what you got. Dad shouldn't have done that. I am disappointed. That was it. No, Mom. No, respectfully. I stared at those words for minutes, my stomach churning. I didn't reply, but I opened an old notebook, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote a letter. Not to her, but to myself. A way to organize everything I never said. I wrote about the times I skipped buying new clothes so she could have better school supplies. About nights when Joaquin worked late, and I made up stories so she wouldn't feel alone. About birthday cakes made with counted coins and nights awake waiting for her to come back from college. And, above all, I wrote about the silence that I had carried for years thinking it was love, at which, deep down, was fear. Fear of not being enough, of not being seen, of losing even the little I had. In the letter, I also wrote about the deed. That it wasn't about money. It was about respect. About recognition that never came in words, but came in a piece of paper that said, "You matter." When I finished, I folded the paper neatly, placed it in a wooden box, and put it in the bottom drawer of the knitstand. It didn't need to be sent. It only needed to exist. Because, for the first time, I was writing not to be read by someone else. I was writing for myself. On Saturday, Mariana invited me to spend the weekend at her house. I accepted. I packed a small bag with light clothes and a book I'd been trying to finish for months. When we arrived, she showed me the guest room decorated with dried flowers and a hand-embroidered quilt. "I made it thinking of you, Mom," she said. I was moved. It was simple, but made with affection. That night, I laughed with the grandchildren, listened to Mariana play guitar, and for a few moments, allowed myself to forget all the bitterness of the past days. Sunday morning, we walked together to the neighborhood market. I bought fresh cheese, 2 loaves of bread, and a pot of lavender. While choosing vegetables, a woman approached me saying, "You're Mariana's mother. How lucky you are. She's so generous." I smiled, a bit awkward. I didn't know what to say. After so many years being only Joaquin's wife, or Letitia's mother, being recognized for another daughter's kindness gave me a new identity, one I was beginning to believe. On the way home, Mariana asked, "Mom, you think about going to Tepoztlan someday? Spending some time there?" I answered honestly, "I do, but not to run away, to start anew." She held my hand and said, "When you go, take me with you." That moved me more than any gift. For the first time, I saw that my story wasn't ending. It was just changing course. Monday morning, I received a call from the lawyer. He said he needed my signature to finalize the property registration. We arranged for 3 p.m., and that morning I prepared calmly. I took a long shower, put on a dark blue dress Joaquin liked, and pinned my hair as I used to when I was younger. It wasn't vanity, it was a way to recognize myself in the mirror, after days feeling invisible even to myself. I took a taxi and went alone to the office. It was an old building in downtown Puebla, with wooden stairs that creaked with every step. The lawyer greeted me with a kind smile. Everything was ready, he said. I just needed to sign, and the property would be officially registered in my name as Joaquin had wished. I signed with steady hands. I didn't feel euphoria, nor anger, nor a desire for revenge. Just an inner calm, as if something had finally fallen into place. On the way out, I sat for a few minutes in a nearby plaza. I bought a coffee from a street stall and watched people come and go. Rushing youths, couples arguing where to have lunch, an old man selling flowers with tired eyes. There, in the middle of that everyday scene, I understood that my life could also move forward. That losing a husband didn't mean losing oneself, and that sometimes we only discover that after a brutal rupture like the one Letitia dealt me. I returned home to find Mariana in the kitchen preparing pumpkin soup. "Did you sign everything, Mum?" I nodded. She didn't ask anything else. She just served me a bowl and sat beside me. We sat in silence, sharing the aroma of hot food and the distant sound of the old radio. No words were needed. Mariana understood, perhaps more than anyone, that that signed paper was more than asset ownership. It was an act of justice. A final seal on a story I had been the sole reader of for many years. Later, as I cleaned the dishes, Mariana put on an old Mercedes Sosa song. Her voice filled the house in a way that made me want to cry, but I held back. I was tired of crying alone. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the melody wash over me. Every word felt like a belated answer to everything I never knew how to ask. And for the first time since the burial, I felt like singing softly, almost in a whisper, yet still my voice. That night, before falling asleep, I turned on the bedside lamp and stared at the ceiling, thinking about how strangely life tests us. Letitia always had everything: education, comfort, attention. And yet she seemed to harbor a grudge I never knew how to reach. Perhaps that's why she hurt me the way she did, because to her, being a daughter was synonymous with demands, not with building. I don't know. All I know is that after that phrase in the cemetery, a part of me died. That another part stronger, more whole was born. In the following days, I started sorting through closets, discarding old papers, tearing up what no longer made sense to keep. I found old letters from Joaquin, photos of the girls when they were little, memories of a time that now seemed too distant to hurt. It wasn't about erasing history. It was about filtering, keeping only what made me smile, because holding on to too much pain hardens the heart, and I had spent too long living with one. That Thursday, I did something I hadn't done in years. I bought a bus ticket, destination, to Postlan, one way with no return date. When Mariana saw the confirmation on my phone, she broke into a smile. "You're really going?" I said. "Now it's my turn to build something just for me." She hugged me tightly, and in that embrace, I felt what every mother wants in return: love without demands, without rancor, without debt. The trip to Tepoztlan was silent, just as I wanted. I chose a window seat and spent most of the journey watching the landscape change. The distant mountains, trees bent by the wind, small crumbling houses here and there. I was leaving behind more than a city. I was leaving a lifetime of concessions, swallowed words, birthdays forgotten for convenience. And for the first time, I felt no guilt about it. I felt relief. I arrived late afternoon, with an orange sky and the fresh scent of fields in the air. The house stood as I remembered: adobe walls, weathered wooden doors, small windows that only let light in one specific way, as if it too asked permission. I opened the gate with an old key I still kept. When I stepped inside the living room, a shiver ran up my legs. This was mine, not just legally but in presence. Truly. I spent the first hours dusting off the accumulated dirt and opening the windows. The light that entered seemed to welcome me. I made coffee, sat on the veranda, and unconsciously began to laugh to myself. It wasn't loud or mocking. It was a calm laughter, like realizing you're truly alive after living on autopilot for so long. Joaquin would have loved to see me there. He always said that house suited me. At the time, I thought it was just a vague compliment. Now I understood. The next morning, I went to the Central Square Market to buy fruit and bread. The vendors were kind, and a lady called me Raina, so naturally that I wanted to hug her. It felt strange to be treated well, without having to prove anything to anyone. I returned with a bag full, and as I prepared breakfast, decided I wouldn't be going back to Puebla anytime soon. That house wasn't just a refuge, it was the first place where I could just be Aina, no one's wife, no one's mother, just myself. In the days that followed, I began painting. Something simple, with cheap brushes and paint I bought at a local shop. I painted fruit, vases, pieces of the backyard. Nothing grandiose, but each stroke seemed to pull an old anguish out of me. I left the canvases drying on the back wall and laughed when the neighbor passed by and shouted, "Que bonito, Señora Artista." Me an artist. Who would have thought? A woman who spent her life fading away was now leaving colorful marks on her own home's walls. At night, I sometimes wrote letters I would never send, to Letitia especially. I wrote what I never had the courage to say, that I loved her, yes, but that I was tired of chasing someone who only saw me as an obstacle. That blood unites, but respect sustains. And that I was okay, not to provoke but to free myself, because I knew that, deep down, she too carried pains she couldn't name. And maybe, one day, she would also write a letter to me, if only in thought. One day I found on the bookshelf a book Joaquin had left there years ago, Chronicles of a Time That Passed. I flipped through it and found, between the pages, a black and white photo of us as a young couple on a picnic, him holding me by the waist. On the back, a note in his handwriting. "Thank you for staying, even when I didn't know how to stay with you." I stood there looking at it, as if watching an old scar truly close. It felt strange. Even dead, Joaquin could still reach me where no one else could. But now I was learning not to live through his choices anymore, nor through Letitia's rejections, nor through anyone's expectations. I was learning with slow steps and paint-stained hands to be whole for myself. And that, for me, was enough. A week after settling into Tepoztlán, I received an unexpected call. It was Letitia's number. My heart raced for an instant, as if still hoping, deep down, for some gesture of reconciliation. I answered in silence. On the other end, her voice was hard, impatient. "I heard you went to the Tepoztlán house. I just wanted to make it clear that, to me, that changes nothing. That was all. No hi, no. How are you?" Just that usual frost in the guise of communication. "Okay." I responded only when hung up before she could say more. I stared at my phone for minutes after that. I didn't cry, but I couldn't smile either. What hurt most wasn't the coldness. It was that I had come to expect it. It had become routine. I realized that, for years, I had fed the hope that Letitia would see me differently. That one day she'd acknowledge my effort, my care, my love. But maybe that day would never come. And that was okay. Because I also needed to free myself from that waiting. That same afternoon, I wrote another letter. Short, this time. I placed it in a box with other keepsakes. It was as if I were organizing my soul into drawers, separating what stayed from what had to go. It was a silent process, but far more powerful than any shout. I began to realize that my life wasn't ending there. It was becoming lighter, less full of demands, more full of truths. On Sunday, I received a visit from a neighbor named Marta, a small woman with snow-white hair and an easy laugh. She brought corn cake and hibiscus tea. We chatted for hours on the veranda, as if we'd known each other for decades. She told me she'd been widowed 5 years ago and had gone through something similar with one of her daughters. "They blame us for pains that aren't even ours," she said, stirring her tea with an aluminum spoon. That struck me deeply. because it was exactly that. I was paying the price for wounds that weren't even mine. The following week, I started walking through the village every morning. I passed the old man selling flowers, children on their way to school, dogs running freely among the cobblestones. Gradually, the faces of the people became familiar, and mine too. I began to be greeted by name. "Good morning, Dona Ana." That gave me a sense of belonging I'd never felt in Puebla. It was as if that quiet, discreet village knew exactly what to do with women who carry the world on their shoulders. It was on one of these walks that I discovered a small pottery workshop. I went in out of curiosity and ended up staying 2 hours, molding clay with the help of a young woman named Cynthia. She taught me to make bowls, pots, and even a small wind chime that I later hung at my front door. Working with my hands brought me a peace I didn't know I was searching for. It was as if each piece of clay molded was a piece of me returning to its place. One Saturday, I decided to call Mariana. I wanted to tell her about the workshop, about Marta, about the wind chime. She answered with a smile, saying she was happy I was so alive there. She asked if she could visit with the boys during the holidays. The idea of children's laughter filling that yard excited me more than anything. "Of course you can, my daughter. This is now also your home." It was true. That house, which began as a secret inheritance, was now becoming a refuge. That night, I sat on the veranda with a blanket over my shoulders and gazed at the starry sky. The mountains in the distance seemed to be sleeping too. I closed my eyes and gave thanks not for everything having turned out right, but for finally stopping the wait for others to save me. Because in that wind-filled silence, I understood. I was saving myself, one gesture at a time. In early August, I received a letter. Yes, a real letter, with a stamped envelope and a postmark. The sender caught me off guard. Letitia. For a second, I thought it was a mistake. I opened it with trembling hands, my heart beating slowly, as if each syllable were a stone. In my stomach, the text was brief, cold, saying only that she had decided to legally contest the deed's validity. That, although our father had registered it, she found it unfair and precipitously emotional. No questions, no empathy, only resentment dressed as legality. I finished reading and stayed motionless in the kitchen chair. The sun shone through the window, illuminating the envelope still on the table. I didn't cry, but I felt a void very much like mourning. Mariana called me later. That day, and without my saying a word, knew something was wrong. "Was it her?" she asked. I replied yes. Mariana sighed and said, "You know she's wrong, right?" I did, but knowing the truth doesn't prevent the pain from returning, especially when that pain wears the face of the one you raised in your arms. I spoke with the lawyer in the following days. He was firm and calm. The deed was legitimate, dated, registered, and complied with all legal procedures. Letitia could try to appeal, that she had no basis. Even so, it consumed me. Not out of fear of losing the house, but because my daughter preferred to attack me rather than try to understand. It was as if to her, my happiness was an affront. As if, after being widowed, I no longer deserved anything that was just mine. The next week, I returned to the pottery workshop, but I couldn't shape anything. My hands were stiff, stuck. Cynthia noticed and invited me to sit. We spoke little. She told me that sometimes, when the clay doesn't respond, it's because you need to stop forcing and just listen. Listen to the silence, the anger, the fatigue. "You're carrying too much, Dona Ana," she said, looking me in the eyes with a sincerity that unraveled me. I left in silence, walking slowly along the cobblestones until I got home. That night, I reopened my box of letters. I reread the ones I never sent, including the one to Letitia weeks earlier. I took a fresh sheet and a blue pen and wrote another. Short, honest. I said I wasn't going to fight, that the house was mine by right and by her father's choice, but that I didn't need to prove anything more. That if she really wanted to erase me from the story, she could keep her part, but that I wouldn't give up my peace for anyone's pride. I ended with a phrase I'd never had the courage to say. "Daughter, I love you. but I will no longer accept being mistreated in the name of that love. I kept the letter for 2 days. Then I sent it. I didn't expect a reply. I didn't want one. It was more an act of liberation than reconciliation. After that, I slept for the first time in weeks without dreaming of arguments, rejections, or imaginary courtrooms. I slept like someone coming home after a long time lost. 2 days later, it rained heavily in Tepoztlan, the kind of rain that washes away even what you can't see. I opened all the windows and let the wind in. It wet the floor a bit, the curtains fluttered, and the sound of water filled everything. I stood in the kitchen doorway, feeling the storm pass. And inside, it seemed another storm was leaving, one that dated back years, of words never spoken, of wounds never faced. The next morning, something changed in me. The letter was sent. The house was mine. My daughter could continue to hate me if she wanted, but I would no longer hate myself in silence for not being the perfect mother she expected. And it was there, over a bitter coffee made on the spot, that I realized maybe I had never learned to say enough with anger, but I had finally learned to say it with calm. In the following days, I felt my body respond differently. I woke earlier, feeling more energized. I resumed walking the village paths and, instead of carrying heavy thoughts, paid attention to details. The smell of bread baking at the corner bakery, the sound of a flute boy played near the school, leaves falling and dancing slowly on the stone ground. Tepoztlan welcomed me with a silent tenderness, without questions, without demanding explanations. I began preparing small breakfasts on the veranda, with freshly squeezed orange juice and bread with fresh cheese. Sometimes I ate alone, sometimes with Marta, who always brought some village gossip or a piece of freshly baked pie. She told me stories of people who reinvented themselves late in life, ladies who opened flower shops at 70, men who learned to embroider after 80. We think it's over, but time still has a lot to give if we stop fighting it, she said. One Sunday, I decided to paint an entire wall of the house. I chose a burnt yellow shade, similar to the sunset light that always streamed through the window. I spent the whole day with paint-covered hands, climbing ladders and listening to loud music on the old radio. When I finished, I sat on the floor and stared at that wall. It wasn't just color, it was presence. For the first time, that space reflected who I had become, not who others expected me to be. It was as if I'd finally left my mark where before there was only survival. That night, Mariana called and I could tell by her voice she was moved. I saw the photos you posted. The wall looks beautiful, Mom. It was the first time she called me Mum, so tenderly since Joaquin died. We talked for almost an hour, laughing, remembering, even making Christmas plans. Could we spend it there this year? I didn't hesitate. Of course, my dear. Here is your home too. We agreed to prepare a simple feast together, mixing old and new recipes. She would bring the boys, maybe even her husband could get some days off. And I, for the first time, began thinking about Christmas with joy. Not as a heavy date full of family ghosts, but as a possible new beginning, a delicate reconstruction. I closed my eyes and imagined the house full, the smell of food in the air, laughter echoing off the walls I had painted myself. I returned to the pottery workshop and Cincha greeted me with a hug. You look different, you know? I laughed. Maybe I've become lighter. We shaped new pieces together, and I started making little vases that I planned to give as Christmas favors. She told me she would open an artisan fair and invited me to participate with my work. At first I hesitated, then I accepted. Why not? I thought. If I could make an entire wall smile, why not let my hands tell stories too? The following week, I attended the fair. I set up a simple table with an embroidered cloth and my small vases lined up. A few people passed by, looked, asked questions. I sold 3 on the first day. I received compliments, smiles, even orders. It was the first time in my life that someone paid for something made by my hands, not for what I represented, not for what I did for others, but for something I created. And that filled me with a lasting, calm joy. That night, before sleeping, I wrote in my diary, Today, for the first time, I felt that I'm building something of my own. Not to please, not to prove anything, just to exist fully with my colors, my shapes, my silences. And it's okay if not everyone understands. I understand, and that's enough. Time in Tepoztlán began to settle into a new routine I didn't even know I wanted. My days had their own rhythm, waking early, tending plants, preparing my meals, walking, molding clay, and at night, writing. I no longer wrote letters that would never be sent. I wrote for myself, as if noting proof that my life had value even when no one applauded. I, who had spent decades silent, was becoming the narrator of my own story. One day, a woman who bought one of my vases returned to the fair to thank me. She said she'd placed it in her living room and that every visitor commented on its delicacy. "You put soul into your work, Signora Aina," she said. That moved me more than any gesture in recent years. I'd spent so long being useful, functional, invisible, that hearing someone see my soul felt like a hug that goes right through the skin. A reminder that I never stopped having. Something valuable inside I had just forgotten. At the end of November, I received another letter. This time, not from Letitia, but from her Lawyer. The tone was the same. Cold, threatening, trying once more to question the deed's validity. But now, something in me no longer shook at such an attempt. I showed the letter to my Lawyer, who responded with elegance and firmness. "They can try as much as they want, Dona Aina, but you're protected." I filed the letter away, as one might shelve a memory. That no longer hurts. It existed, yes, but it no longer controlled my present. Mariana was furious when she found out. She wanted to call her sister, confront her, tell her off. I asked her not to. "Daughter, we can't force anyone to love or respect us. And it's not worth wearing ourselves out over someone who's already decided to turn away." Mariana was silent for a moment and hugged me tightly. "I just can't accept that she hurts you like that, Mom." And I answered, voice tight, "She can only hurt me if I let her, and I no longer let her." December arrived with the scent of pine, artisan panettone, and children's laughter in the village streets. The house took on a livelier vibe with Christmas preparations. I set up a small tree with dried branches, ribbons, and ornaments I'd made in clay. Mariana arrived a few days before Christmas Eve with the boys, who filled the yard with life. They ran around, climbed chairs, laughed loudly, knocked things over, and I loved every second of that. Sweet chaos. For the first time, the house's silence was broken by sounds worth hearing. On Christmas Eve, we had a simple but affectionate feast. Empanadas, rice with almonds, fresh salad, and a chocolate cake made by Mariana. We ate on the veranda, illuminated by twinkling lights that glittered like fireflies. After dinner, each of us read a small letter of wishes for the coming year. When it was my turn, I read aloud. I wished to continue living lightly, with honesty, with joy, and if possible in peace with who I am. I didn't mention Letitia. It was no longer about her. It was about me. After dinner, the boys fell asleep curled up on the sofa, and Mariana and I stayed talking late into the night. We laughed over old stories, remembered their father, talked about fears and new beginnings. At some point, she took my hand and said, "You look more beautiful, Mom. There's a different glow about you." I smiled. Maybe it's what remains when you stop fading for others. And in that moment, I realized it had all been worth the pain. Because, in the end, I hadn't lost my daughter. I had found again the one who never stopped seeing me. On the morning of the 25th, upon opening the front door, I found an envelope left at the gate. It was from Letitia, just my name in her familiar but shaky handwriting. I went back inside with sweaty hands. I opened it calmly, seated in the kitchen with a cup of tea. The letter was brief. It said she couldn't forgive me for what she called silent betrayal, but that she recognized I was only fulfilling our father's will. If one day I can look at all this without anger, maybe we'll talk. For now, I just wanted you to know I read your letter. There were no apologies, but there was a sign. And strangely, that was enough for me. I folded Letitia's letter carefully and placed it in my diary, between 2 pages about new beginnings. I didn't cry, but I sat there for a long time, watching the cup cool. It was strange how such a small gesture could stir so much inside me. She hadn't asked for forgiveness, but for the first time, it seemed she had seen me as a person, not just as an obstacle. And that alone was a step I never imagined she'd take. In the days that followed, I kept thinking about the phrase silent betrayal. It echoed inside me like a stone rolling back and forth. Had she felt betrayed because I accepted our father's gift? Or because I didn't explain anything? Because I defended myself in silence after years of being quiet? Maybe yes, maybe no. But one thing was certain. I too had felt betrayed many times. And I never threw that in anyone's face. Mariana noticed I was quieter and asked if I was okay. I told her about her sister's letter, and she just nodded. Maybe one day she'd understand. Maybe not. But you did what you had to do, Mom. And that's not selfish, it's protection. I smiled, relieved to hear that. I had spent so long thinking I needed to justify every choice. And now I realized that sometimes living with dignity is explanation enough. In early January, the village returned to its calm rhythm. Tourists went away, the market stalls emptied, and the wind blew gently again, soft, constant, almost tender. I resumed my pottery classes and began working on a new set of pieces, this time with freer forms, less perfect. Cynthia laughed when she saw one of my wonky vases. Now you're creating with freedom. And I understood. My hands were beginning to reflect the woman I was becoming. One Saturday afternoon, Marta came to my house with a package wrapped in a floral cloth. It was a tablecloth she had embroidered herself, with my name and some flowers around it. So you remember you have roots here too? I hugged her tightly, grateful. It was hard to explain what that village, those simple, generous people had done for me. But I knew. They had returned a kind of humanity I thought I'd lost in Puebla. That same night, while cleaning the kitchen, I thought of Joaquin. Not with pain, but with calm affection. I wondered if he had foreseen all this. If by leaving that deed in secret, he already knew how Letitia would react. Perhaps it was his way of protecting me after everything. Or maybe, at life's end, he finally understood how much I deserved more than silence and resignation. Whatever the case, I felt that he, from somewhere, was still watching and was at peace with what I chose to do. One night, I dreamt of the little girls. The 3 of us were in a kitchen making cookies, and Letitia hugged me from behind. I woke with wet eyes and a light heart. It wasn't prophecy. It was just my heart telling me there was still space maybe for forgiveness. But that space didn't need to be forced. It could simply exist, silent and possible, waiting for the right moment. And if that moment never came, that was okay too. At the end of January, I was invited to participate in a small local exhibition where regional artists and artisans displayed their work in the town hall courtyard. I was surprised by the invitation, and even more by Cynthia's enthusiasm, who insisted I exhibit my vases and wind chimes. You have a rare sensitivity, Dona Ana. People need to see it. I accepted, shy but happy. I spent the following days carefully cleaning each piece, painting small details and wrapping them in old newspaper. On the day of the exhibition, I arrived early with my table set up beside a man carving wooden dolls. The courtyard gradually filled with people of all ages. Laughter, overlapping conversations, children running about. And there I was, seated behind my table, watching people touch my pieces with curiosity, some buying, others asking how I made them. A lady told me, "Your hands have memory. You can feel it." And I thought, yes, my hands hold the memory of a lifetime in silence, but now they speak. Mid-afternoon, a familiar voice called me. It was Mariana. She had come unexpectedly with the children. She brought flowers and a tight hug. "I came to see my artist, Mom," she said, laughing. The boys ran around the fair, delighted. Mariana stayed with me the rest of the day, helping, chatting, introducing me to others as this is my mother, she makes all these beautiful things. That filled me with pride. For the first time, I felt truly seen. After the exhibition, we sat together on a stone bench, eating lemon sorbet. The sun was setting, and the children's shouts mingled with the sound of a street accordion. Mariana looked at me and said, "I wish I had protected you more, Mom, especially from Letitia. But I also thought you were invincible." I smiled tenderly. "Maybe I let you think that, because even I thought so." We hugged there, unhurried, as if reconciling with lost time. In the weeks that followed, I continued my simple routine, but now with a new taste. Belonging. The Tepoztlan house, which began as a hiding place, became a center of life. I hosted neighbors for coffee, exchanged recipes, laughed with Marta, wrote short chronicles. In my notebook, little records of everything I was living. Sometimes I thought of sending them to the local paper, but I kept them just for me. It was like documenting proof that starting over has no age limit. Mariana called almost every day. And one day, surprisingly, she said, "Mom, Letitia texted me. Nothing big. She just asked if the boys were okay and how you were." I froze for a few seconds. I didn't know what to think or expect, but something inside me calmed. Maybe she was opening a crack, and this time, I wouldn't force the door, but I wouldn't close it either. That day, I went to the backyard, sat by the vases, and began writing a new letter. Not to Letitia, not to Mariana, but to myself again. I wrote about everything I had built in the past months, about the woman I was, the one I was prevented from being, and especially the one I was finally allowing myself to be. I wrote as if leaving a note for an Aina from another life, to let her know it was still possible to bloom after neglect, that there was still beauty in existing, even when applause didn't come from those we expected. And that night, as the wind gently swayed the ceramic chimes on the veranda, I realized something I had never felt so strongly. I was no longer waiting for anyone. Not for reconciliations, not for explanations. And yet, I had never been so at peace. Because the greatest turn in my life wasn't what Joaquin left written. It was what I finally wrote within myself. February arrived with its cold mornings and sunny afternoons. Tepoztlan was quieter outside the tourist season, and I liked that. I could walk the streets unhurried, greet every familiar face, stop in the square just to feel the sun on my face. It was as if each day I were building a life that owed nothing to anyone my own life for the first time. The small details had become what sustained my days. The smell of freshly brewed coffee, the sound of chimes in the wind, the lightness of no longer having to prove anything. One Sunday afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. It was Hugo, Letitia's husband. He came alone, unannounced, with a bag of clothes for the boys' presents. He said Letitia had sent. I was surprised. It wasn't the kind of gesture that came from her. I invited him in, and he accepted. We sat on the veranda, and for a few minutes we were silent. Then he said, "I don't know what's happening between you two, but I thought what she tried to do with the house was unfair. I just wanted you to know that." I was taken aback. I hadn't expected solidarity, let alone justice from him. I always saw him as cold and distant. But there, on that silent afternoon, a crack seemed to open. He told me Letitia had been more closed off than ever, living in conflict with everything, even with her own reflection. She has unresolved issues with Dad. She never truly blamed you, you know, but she doesn't know where to put her pain. That hurt me, not to exonerate her, but to realize that perhaps she too was a prisoner of a poorly tended past. When he left, I sat for a long time in the rocking chair, listening to the birds and thinking about his words. Perhaps Letitia was trying to hurt me as a way not to hurt herself more. Perhaps anger was the only language she learned to speak clearly. And perhaps I had spent my whole life trying to reach a version of her that never existed. It was liberating to think that, even if painful, because deep down, I also needed to forgive myself for waiting so long for someone who could never give me what I wanted. In the days that followed, I focused on preparing the next batch of ceramics for the upcoming fair. Now I made more delicate chimes with leaf designs and small hand-engraved phrases. Time is healing. Respect begins within. Don't erase yourself for anyone. It was as if each piece carried a bit of the story I no longer told with words. And seeing others buy them, take them home, made me feel that part of my truth was spreading into the world, even if no one knew its origin. Mariana remained present, ever closer. She called almost daily, sent photos of the children, asked how the vases, the plants, the weather were. Sometimes, after hanging up, I cried softly, not from sadness, but from gratitude. It was as if she were telling me every day, without saying it, "You still matter. I see you." And after so many years being treated like a burden, that was like a new spring in my chest. I began jotting down ideas for a small memoir, not something to sell or show others, but as a record of what I experienced, what I learned, what I endured in silence, and what I transformed with my hands. Each chapter would bear the name of a ceramic piece, the cracked bowl, the vase that wouldn't dry, the yellow wall, the chime of forgiveness. It was my way of naming what I never fully allowed myself to feel, of finally telling the story from my perspective. And it was drafting that outline on a quiet, cool night that I realized everything changed when I stopped waiting for the apology that never came. When I stopped begging for affection and began offering love only where the ground was fertile. Because love is also knowing when to stop. And I had finally learned to stop without feeling diminished. One tranquil March afternoon, I received a different envelope. It was from the local school. Inside was an invitation. They wanted me to hold a workshop with the students, teaching them pottery. They said they'd seen my work at the fair, and it would be special to bring in someone from the community to inspire the children. I was moved. I had spent my life as a homemaker, silent, useful in the background. And now, at 67, someone saw me as a creative example. I accepted immediately, my heart beating like a girl's invited onto the stage. On the day of the workshop, I took my tools, some simple molds, and an old apron stained with clay. The children surrounded me with curiosity. There was a boy who kept asking how to make perfect edges, a girl who wanted to draw flowers everywhere, and a boy who made a lopsided vase and said it was a monster with a mouth. We laughed a lot, and I taught not only techniques but also the freedom to make mistakes. Clay accepts everything, even what you think is wrong. Sometimes that's where the most beautiful things are born. When I returned home that day, I felt like crying with joy. I felt useful again, not out of obligation, but out of connection. It was different. It filled me with an energy I hadn't felt in ages. I made hibiscus tea and sat on the veranda, watching the sky darken slowly. I thought of Joaquin. I thought of the little girls. I even thought of Letitia and, for the first time, without resentment, just with a calm hope that wherever she was also finding some form of lightness. At the end of March, I received another letter from her. She wrote in her usual hurried handwriting, but something in the tone was different. She said she had read my letter many times, that she was still hurt, still confused, but beginning to understand that I, too, had been hurt in other ways. She said she couldn't promise anything, not presence, not reconciliation, but maybe one day she'd want to talk. And she ended with, "Take care, Mom." It was little, but it was a lot. It was a crack. And this time, I knew to respect her time as I learned to respect mine. I showed the letter to Mariana. She smiled and silently held my hand. We didn't celebrate or make plans. We just left that hope quietly there, like a seed planted in fertile soil. I no longer needed Letitia's return to feel whole, but if one day she came back, I would know there'd be a place for her without judgment. Because, contrary to what she thought, I never stopped being her mother. I just stopped sacrificing myself for a love that didn't come. With April arriving, I decided to replant my garden. I went to the market and bought new seedlings, lavender, rosemary, daisies. I spent 2 days digging up old roots, making space for new colors. It was therapeutic. Each plant I put in the ground was like a small promise to myself. I still have a future. Because if nature teaches anything, It's that everything can start over, sometimes more beautiful after the pain. That same week, I published my first essay in the local newsletter. It spoke about starting over after 60, about building with one's own hands an inner home. I received some notes left at the gate. Beautiful writing, Signora Aina. I identified with you so much. Thank you for writing from the heart. It was as if, little by little, my story ceased to be only mine, and that filled me. Because telling became more than a vent, it became a bridge. That night, before sleeping, I looked at myself in the mirror. I saw wrinkles, scars, eyes marked by time, but I also saw firmness. I saw a woman who no longer begs who builds, who no longer waits who plants, who no longer carries those who don't want to walk, who chooses who is worth every step. And I wished myself good night, as if I were learning, finally, to love myself without needing anyone else to confirm it. May arrived with its warm, silent breeze, the kind that sweeps away what no longer serves. The garden bloomed with vigor, as if each plant was also living a second chance. I woke early, sat on the veranda with chamomile tea, and stayed there watching the day break. Nothing demanded hurry anymore. Nothing bound me to the need to prove my worth. For the first time, my time was mine, and I was learning to fill it with lightness. It was on one of those mornings that I heard footsteps at the gate. When I looked up, my heart stopped for a second. Letitia, standing there with a small bag in hand and a tired face. She looked around for a long moment before speaking. May I come in? I didn't know how to respond with words. I simply opened the gate. The creak of the hinges sounded so loud. In that moment, as if each inch of iron were announcing that something important was happening. She entered slowly, as if stepping into unfamiliar ground. She looked around, noticed the garden, the yellow wall, the hanging ceramic chimes. "Did you do all this alone?" she asked. I nodded. She let out a low sigh, as if admitting something without saying it. We sat on the veranda, each with our own cup, and silence settled between us like a third presence. But this time, it wasn't the silence of conflict, it was the silence of bridges being built, slowly. Letitia was the first to break the silence. I read your letter many times. Her voice trembled but was steady. I think I spent my whole life trying to demand from you what Dad never gave me. And deep down, I think I blamed you for that, without reason, because you were always there, and I never knew how to see that. My eyes filled with tears. I didn't respond right away. I just took her hand cold as stone and held it. And there, in that touch, there was already more of an answer than any speech could offer. When I finally spoke, I was honest. I told her I, too, had stayed silent too long. That I waited for gestures, words, hugs that never came. That it hurt, yes, and deeply. But that I no longer held any anger, only exhaustion. I love you, Letitia, but I learned that love without respect hurts. And I will no longer accept being hurt to keep anyone close. She didn't reply. She only let a single tear fall. And I let mine fall too. Because some wounds only heal when seen together. We spent the afternoon walking around the yard, watering plants, shaping a small vase. I spoke little, she even less. Yet the silence no longer hurt. It was comfortable. It was a beginning. Before leaving, Letitia looked at me and said, "I still have much to understand, but if you still have a space, I'd like to return little by little." And I smiled. This is no place to banish anyone. I've just learned to lock the doors I used to. Leave wide open. If you know how to knock gently, there will always be space. After she left, I went inside, washed her cup, and looked at my reflection in the kitchen window. I saw new wrinkles, old scars, and a glow I recognized, but that I had never accepted as mine. It was peace. It was firmness. It was the face of a woman who survived losses, abuses, and silences, and who still chose not to harden. That night, I wrote in my diary again. But unlike before, it wasn't a letter to anyone. It was a testimony to myself. Today, my daughter returned, but the whole woman who came back was me. I closed the notebook with a lump in my throat and certainty in my heart. It wasn't about being right. It was about not losing oneself. And I, finally, was where I belonged. The next day, I hung my new wind chimes at the fair. One of them was engraved, "Where there is truth, there's no need to shout," and it rang loudly in the morning breeze. I saw people pause, smile, and touch the vases gently. And I understood that, even if no one knows my story, it's no longer confined to me. It lives there in every piece shaped with the strength that remained after the pain. If today someone asks me how it all began, I answer without hesitation. It began on the day I heard, at my husband's funeral, that I was no longer part of the family. But the truth is that, at that exact moment, I stopped being a shadow. And since then, I've never stopped blooming. Sometimes life truly begins when we stop waiting for others to recognize what we feel. I took many years to understand that, but today I can say calmly, choosing your own peace isn't selfish, it's survival. And if you've made it this far, perhaps you're carrying silences no one has seen.